Chapter 8. The house was in darkness as we approached. "Here it is," Paul said. "Follow me." An iron ladder was attached to the side of the house. We made our way over to it. The mud was frozen beneath our feet, sculpted into hard ripples and ridges. Without waiting for me, Paul started climbing up. It was getting colder by the minute. I was wondering if this was such a good idea. I followed him and gripped the first rung, icy and slippery. It was overgrown with some kind of climbing plant. Ivory, perhaps. I made my way up, rung by rung. By the time I reached the top, my fingers were numbed and the wind was slashing my face. I climbed over onto the roof. Paul was waiting for me, grinning in an excited adolescent's way. The razor-thin moon hung above us. The rest was darkness. Suddenly, Paul rushed at me, a strange expression on his face. I felt a flicker of panic as his arm reached out toward me. I swerved to avoid it, but he grabbed hold of me. For a terrifying second, I thought he was going to throw me off the roof. Instead, he pulled me toward him. "You're too close to the edge. Stay in the middle here. It's safer." I nodded, catching my breath. This was a bad idea. I didn't feel remotely safe around Paul. I was about to suggest climbing down again. Then he pulled out his cigarettes and offered me one. I hesitated, then I accepted. My fingers were shaking as I took out my lighter and lit the cigarettes. We stood there and smoked in silence for a moment. This is where we would sit, Alicia and me, every day, pretty much. "How old were you?" "I was about 7, maybe 8. Alicia couldn't have been more than 10. "You were a bit young to be climbing ladders." "I suppose so. Seemed normal to us. When we were teenagers, we'll come up and smoke and drink beers." I tried to picture a teenage Alicia, hiding from her father and her bullying aunt. Paul, her adoring younger cousin, falling up the ladder, pestering her when she'd much rather be silent, alone with her thoughts. "It's a good hiding place," I said. Paul nodded. "Uncle Vernon couldn't make it up the ladder. He had a big build, like Mum. I could barely make it up myself. That ivory is a death trap." "It's not ivory, it's jasmine." Paul looked at the green vines that curl over the top of the ladder. "No flowers yet, not until the spring. Smells like perfume then, when there's a lot of it." He seemed lost in a memory for a moment. "Funny that." "What?" "Nothing," he shrugged. "The things you remember. I just was thinking about the jasmine. It was in full bloom that day, the day of the accident when Eva was killed." I looked around. "You and Alicia came up here together, you said?" He nodded. "Mum and Uncle Vernon were looking for us down there. I could hear them calling, but we didn't say a word. We stayed hiding, and that's when it happened." He stubbed out his cigarette and gave me an odd smile. "That's why I brought you here, so you can see it, the scene of the crime." "The crime?" Paul didn't answer, just kept grinning at me. "What crime, Paul?" "Vernon's crime. Uncle Vernon wasn't a good man, you see." "No, not at all." "What are you trying to say?" "Well, that's when he did it." "Did what?" "That's when he killed Alicia." I stared at Paul, unable to believe my ears. "Killed Alicia? What are you talking about?" Paul pointed at the ground below. "Uncle Vernon was down there with Mum. He was drunk. Mum kept trying to get him to go back inside, but he stood down there, yelling for Alicia. He was so angry with her, he was so mad. Because Alicia was hiding? But she was a child. Her mother had just died. He was a mean bastard. The only person he ever cared about was Auntie Eva. I suppose that's why he said it." "Said what?" I was losing patience. "I don't understand what you're saying to me. What exactly happened?" "Vernon was going on about how much he loved Eva, how he couldn't live without her. 'My girl,' he kept saying. 'My poor girl, my Eva. Why did she have to die? Why did it have to be her? Why didn't Alicia die instead?" I stared at Paul for a second, stunned. I wasn't sure I understood. "Why didn't Alicia die instead?" "That's what he said." "Alicia heard this?" "Yeah, and Alicia whispered something to me. I'll never forget it. 'He killed me,' she said. 'That just killed me.'" I stared at Alicia, speechless. A chorus of bells started ringing in my head, clanging, trimming, reverberating. This was what I'd been looking for. I found it, the missing piece of the jigsaw, at last, here on a roof in Cambridge. All the way back to London, I kept thinking about the implications of what I had heard. I understood now why Alcestis had struck a chord with Alicia. Just as Admetus had physically condemned Alcestis to die, so had Vernon Rose physically condemned his daughter to death. Admetus must have loved Alcestis on some level, but there was no love in Vernon Rose, just hate. He had committed psychic infanticide, and Alicia knew it. He killed me, she said. That just killed me. Now at last I had something to work with, something I knew about. The emotional effects of psychological wounds on children and how they manifest themselves later in adults. Imagine it. Hearing your father, the very person you depend upon for your survival, wishing you dead. How terrifying that must be for a child. How traumatizing. How your sense of self-worth would implode and the pain would be too great, too huge to feel, so you'll swallow it, repress it, bury it. Over time, you would lose contact with the origins of your trauma, dissociate the roots of its cause, and forget. But one day, all the hurt and anger would burst forth like fire from a dragon's belly, and you'll pick up a gun. You'll visit that rage not upon your father, who was dead and forgotten and out of reach, but upon your husband, the man who had taken his place in your life, who loved you and shared your bed. You shoot him 5 times in the head without possibly even knowing why. The train raced through the night back to London. At last I thought, at last I knew how to reach her. Now we could begin. Chapter 9. I sat with Alicia in silence. I was getting better at these silences, better at enduring them, settling into them, and toughing it out. It had become almost comfortable sitting in that small room with her, keeping quiet. Alicia held her hands in her lap, clenching and unclenching them rhythmically, like a heartbeat. She was facing me, not looking at me, but gazing out of the window through the bars. It had stopped raining and the clouds momentarily parted to reveal a pale blue sky. Then another cloud appeared, obscuring it with gray. Then I spoke. There's something I have become aware of, something your cousin told me. I said this as gently as I could. She didn't react, so I went on. Paul said that when you were a child, you overheard your father say something devastating. After the car accident that killed your mother, you heard him say that he wished you had died instead of her. I was certain there would be a knee-jerk physical reaction, an acknowledgement of some kind. I waited, but none came. I wonder how you feel about Paul telling me this. It might seem like a betrayal of confidence, but I believe he had your best interests in mind. You are, after all, in my care. No response. I hesitated. It might help you if I tell you something. No, perhaps that's being disingenuous. Perhaps it's me. It would help. The truth is, I understand you better than you think. Without wishing to disclose too much, you and I experienced similar kinds of childhoods with similar kinds of fathers, and we both left home as soon as we could. But we soon discovered that geographical distance counts for little in the world of the psyche. Some things are not so easily left behind. I know how damaging your childhood was. It's important you understand how serious this is. What your father said is tantamount to psychic murder. He killed you. This time she reacted. She looked up sharply, straight at me. Her eyes seemed to burn right through me. If looks could kill, I would have dropped dead. I met her murderous gaze without flinching. Alicia, this is our last chance. I'm sitting here now without Professor Diomedes' knowledge or permission. If I keep breaking the rules like this for your sake, I'm going to get fired. That's why this will be the last time you see me. Do you understand? I said this without any expectation or emotion, train of hope or feeling. I was sick of bashing my head against a wall. I didn't expect any kind of response, and then I thought I had imagined it at first. I thought I was hearing things. I stared at her, breathless. I felt my heart thumping in my chest. My mouth was dry when I spoke. Did you just say something? Another silence. I must have been mistaken. I must have imagined it. But then it happened again. Alicia's lips moved slowly, painfully. Her voice cracked a little as it emerged, like a creaking gate that needed oiling. What? She whispered. Then she stopped and again. What? What? For a moment we just stared at each other. My eyes slowly filled with tears. Tears of disbelief, excitement, and gratitude. What do I want? I want you to keep talking. Talk. Talk to me, Alicia. Alicia stared at me. She was thinking about something. She came to a decision. She slowly nodded. Okay, she said. Chapter 10. She said what? Professor Diomedes stared at me with a look of stunned amazement. We were outside smoking. I could tell he was excited because he had dropped his cigar on the ground without even noticing. She spoke? Alicia really spoke? She did. Incredible. So you were right, and I was wrong. Not at all. It was wrong of me to see her without your permission, Professor. I'm sorry, I just had an instinct. Diomedes waved me away my apology and finished my sentence for me. You follow your gut. I would have done the same, Theo. Well done. I was unwilling to be too celebratory. We mustn't count our chickens yet. It's a breakthrough, yes, but there's no guarantee. She might revert or regress at any point. Diomedes nodded. Quite right. We must organize a formal review and interview Alicia as soon as possible. Get her in front of a panel, you and me, and someone from the trust. Julian will do. He's harmless enough. You're going too fast. You're not listening to me. That's too soon. Anything like that would scare her. We need to move slowly. Well, it's important the trust knows. No, not yet. Maybe this was a one-off. Let's wait. Let's not make any announcements yet. Not just yet. Diomedes nodded, taking this in. His hand reached for my shoulder and gripped it. Well done. I'm proud of you. I felt a small flicker of pride, a son congratulated by his father. I was conscious of my desire to please Diomedes, justify his faith in me and make him proud. I felt a little emotional. I lit a cigarette to disguise it. What now? Now you keep going. Keep working with Alicia. And if Stephanie finds out, forget Stephanie, leave her to me. You focus on Alicia, and so I did. During our next session, Alicia and I talked non-stop. Or rather, Alicia talked and I listened. Listening to Alicia was an unfamiliar and somewhat disconcerting experience. After so many silence, she spoke hesitantly at first, tentatively, trying to walk on legs that hadn't been used in a while. She soon found her feet, picking up speed and agility, tripping through sentences as if she had never been silent, which in a way she hadn't. When the session ended, I went to my office. I sat at the desk, transcribing what had been said while it was still fresh in my mind. I wrote down everything, word for word, capturing it as precisely and accurately as possible. As you will see, it's an incredible story. Of that there is no doubt. Whether you believe it or not is up to you. Chapter 11. Alicia sat in the chair opposite me in the therapy room. Before we began, I have some questions for you. A few things I'd like to clarify. No reply. Alicia looked at me with that unreadable look of hers. Specifically, I want to understand your silence. I want to know why you refuse to speak. Alicia seemed disappointed by the question. She turned and looked out the window. We sat like that in silence for a minute or so. I tried to contain the suspense I was feeling. Had the breakthrough been temporary? Would we now go on as before? I couldn't let that happen. Alicia, I know it's difficult, but once you start talking to me, you'll find it easier. I promise. No response. Try, please. Don't give up when you made such progress. Keep going. Tell me. Tell me why you wouldn't speak. Alicia turned back and stared at me with a chilly gaze. She spoke in a low voice. Nothing. Nothing to say. I'm not sure I believed that. I think there was too much to say. A pause. A shrug. Perhaps. You're right. Go on. She hesitated. At first, when he was dead, I couldn't. I tried, but I couldn't talk. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out, like in a dream. Where you tried to scream, but you can't. You were in a state of shock, but over the next few days, you must have found your voice returning to you. By then, it seemed pointless. It was too late. Too late to speak in your defense? Alicia held me in her gaze, a cryptic smile on her lips. She didn't speak. Tell me why you started talking again. You know the answer. Do I? Because of you. Me? I looked at her with surprise. Because you came here, and that made a difference? All the difference. It made all the difference. Alicia lowered her voice and stared at me, unblinking. I want you to understand what happened to me, what it felt like. It's important. You understand. I want to understand. That's why you gave me the diary, isn't it? Because you want me to understand? It seems to me the people who matter most to you didn't believe your story about the man. Perhaps you're wondering if I believe you. You believe me. This was not a question, but a simple statement of fact. I nodded. Yes, I believe you. So why don't we start there? The last diary entry you wrote described the man breaking into the house. What happened then? Nothing. Nothing? She shook her head. It wasn't him. It wasn't? Then who was it? It was Jean Felix. He he had come to talk about the exhibition. Judging by your diary, it doesn't seem you were in the right state of mind for visitors. Alicia acknowledged this with a shrug. Did he stay long? No, I asked him to leave. He didn't want to. He was upset. He shouted at me a bit, but he went after a while. And then, what happened after she and Felix left? Alicia shook her head. I don't want to talk about that. No? Not yet. Alicia's eyes looked into mine for a moment. Then they darted to the window. Considering the darkening sky beyond the bars, something in the way she was tilting her head was almost courteous, and the beginning of a smile was forming at the corner of her mouth. She's enjoying this, I thought, having me in her power. What do you want to talk about? I asked. I don't know. Nothing. I just want to talk. So we talked. We talked about Linda and Paul and about her mother and the summer she died. We talked about Alicia's childhood and mine. I told her about my father and growing up in that house. She seemed curious to know as much as possible about my past and what had shaped me and made me who I am. I remember thinking, there's no going back now. We were crashing through every last boundary between therapist and patient. Soon it would be impossible to tell who was who. Chapter 12. The next morning we met again. Alicia seemed different that day somehow, more reserved, more guarded. I think it's because she was preparing herself to talk about the day of Gabriel's death. She sat opposite me and unusually for her, looked straight at me and maintained eye contact throughout. She started speaking without being prompted, slowly, thoughtfully, choosing each phrase with care as if cautiously applying brushstroke to a canvas. I was alone that afternoon. I knew I had to paint, but it was so hot. I didn't think I could face it, but I decided to try. So I took the little fan I brought down to the studio in the garden and then, my phone rang. It was Gabriel. He was calling to say he'd be back late from the shoot. Did he normally do that? Call to say he would be late? Alicia gave me an odd look as if it struck her as a strange question. She shook her head. No, why? I wondered if he might be calling for another reason, to see how you were feeling. Judging from your diary, it sounds like he was concerned about your mental state. Oh, Alicia pondered this, taken aback. She slowly nodded. I see. Yes, possibly. I'm sorry. I interrupted you. Go on. What happened after the phone call? Alicia hesitated. I saw him. Him? The man. I saw his reflection, reflected in the window. He was inside the studio, standing right behind me. Alicia shut her eyes and sat quite still. There was a long pause. I spoke gently. Can you describe him? What did he look like? She opened her eyes and stared at me for a moment. He was tall, strong. I couldn't see his face. He had put on a mask, a black mask, but I could see his eyes. They were dark holes, no light in them at all. What did you do when you saw him? Nothing. I was so scared. I kept looking at him. He had a knife in his hand. I asked what he wanted. He didn't speak, and I said I had money in the kitchen, in my bag, and he shook his head and said, I don't want money. And he laughed, a horrible laugh, like breaking glass. He held the knife up to my neck. The sharp end of the blade was against my throat, against my skin. He told me to go with him into the house. Alicia shut her eyes as she remembered. He led me out of that studio, onto the lawn. We walked throughout the house. I could see the gate to the street, just a few meters away. I was so close to it, and something in me took over. It was my only chance to escape. So I kicked him hard and broke away from him, and I ran. I ran for the gate. Her eyes opened and she smiled at the memory. For a few seconds, I was free. Her smile faded. Then he jumped on me, on my back. We fell to the ground. His hand was over my mouth, and I felt the cold blade against my throat. He said he'll kill me if I moved. We laid there for a few seconds, and I could feel his breath on my face. It stank. Then he pulled me up and dragged me into the house. And then, what happened? He locked the door, and I was trapped. Alicia's breathing was heavy and her cheeks were flushed. I was concerned she was becoming distressed, and I was wary of pushing her too hard. Do you need a break? She shook her head. Let's keep going. I've waited long enough to say this. I want to get it over with. Are you sure? It might be a good idea to take a moment. She hesitated. Can I have a cigarette? A cigarette? I didn't know you smoked. I don't. I used to. Can you give me one? How do you know I smoke? I can smell it on you. Oh, I smiled, feeling a little embarrassed. Okay, I stood up. Let's go outside. Chapter 13. The courtyard was populated with patients. They were huddled about in their usual groups, gossiping, arguing, smoking. Some were hugging themselves and stamping their feet to keep warm. Alicia put a cigarette to her lips, holding it between her long, thin fingers. I lit it for her. As the flame caught the tip of her cigarette, it crackled and glowed red. She inhaled deeply, her eyes on mine. She seemed almost amused. Aren't you going to smoke? Or is that inappropriate, sharing a cigarette with a patient? She's making fun of me, I thought, but she was right too. No regulation prohibited a member of staff and a patient from having a cigarette together, but if staff smoked, they tended to do it covertly, sneaking to the fire escape at the back of the building. They certainly didn't do it in front of the patients. To stand here in the courtyard and smoke with her did feel like a transgression. I was probably imagining it, but I felt we were being watched. I sensed Christian spying on us from the window. His words came back to me. Borderlines are seductive. I looked into Alicia's eyes. They weren't seductive. They weren't even friendly. A fierce mind was behind those eyes, a sharp intelligence that was only just waking up. She was a force to be reckoned with. Alicia Berenson. I understood that now. Perhaps that's why Christian had felt the need to sedate her. Was he scared of what she might do, what she might say? I felt a little scared of her myself. Not scared exactly, but alert, apprehensive. I think I had to watch my step. Why not? I said. I'll have one too. I put a cigarette in my mouth and lit it. We smoked in silence for a moment, maintaining eye contact, only inches from each other, until I felt a strange adolescent's embarrassment and inverted my gaze. I tried to cover it by gesturing at the courtyard. Shall we walk and talk? Alicia nodded. Okay. We started walking around the wall, along the perimeter of the courtyard. The other patients watched us. I wonder what they were thinking. Alicia didn't seem to care. She didn't even seem to notice them. We walked in silence for a moment. Eventually, she said, "Do you want me to go on?" "If you want to, yes." "Are you ready?" Alicia nodded. "Yes, I am." "What happened once you were inside the house?" The man said. He said he wanted a drink, so I gave him one of Gabriel's beers. I don't drink beer. I didn't have anything else in the house. And then he talked. "What about?" "I don't remember." "You don't?" "No." She lapsed into silence. I waited as long as I could bear before prompting her. "Let's keep going. You were in the kitchen. How were you feeling?" I don't remember feeling anything at all." I nodded. "That's not uncommon in these situations. It's not just a case of flight or fight responses. There's a third, equally common response when we're under attack. We freeze." "I didn't freeze." "No?" "No." She shot me a fierce look. I was preparing myself. I was getting ready to fight, ready to kill him. "I see. And how did you intend to do that?" "Gabriel's gun. I knew I had to get to the gun." "It was in the kitchen? You had put it there?" "That's what you wrote in the diary." Alicia nodded. "Yes, in the cupboard by the window." She inhaled deeply and blew out a long line of smoke. I told him I needed some water. I went to get a glass. I walked across the kitchen. It took forever to walk a few feet, step by step. I reached the cupboard. My hand was shaking. I opened it, and the cupboard was empty. The gun was gone, and then I heard him say, "The glasses are in the cupboard to your right." I turned around and the gun was there in his hand. He was pointing it at me and laughing. And then? What were you thinking? That it had been my last chance to escape, and now he was going to kill me. You believed he was going to kill you? I knew he was. But then why did he delay? Why not do it as soon as he broke into the house? Alicia didn't answer. I glanced at her. To my surprise, a smile was on her lips. When I was young, Aunt Lydia had a tabby cat. I didn't like her much. She was wild and she'd go for me sometimes with her claws. She was unkind and cruel. Don't animals act out of instinct? Can they be cruel? Alicia looked at me intently. They can be cruel. She would bring in things from the field. Mice or little birds she'll caught and they were always half alive, wounded, but alive. She'll keep them like that and play with them. I see. It sounds like you're saying you were this man's prey? That he was playing some kind of sadistic game with you? Is that right? Alicia dropped the end of her cigarette on the ground and stepped on it. "Give me another one." I handed her the pack. She took one and lit the cigarette herself. She smoked for a moment. Gabriel was coming home at 8. 2 more hours. I kept staring at the clock. "What's the matter?" he said. "Don't you like spending time with me?" And he stroked my skin with the gun, running it up and down my arm. She shivered at the memory. I said Gabriel was going to be home any minute. "And what then?" he asked. "I'll rescue you." "And what did you say?" "I didn't say anything. I just kept staring at the clock, and then my phone rang. It was Gabriel. He told me to answer it. He held the gun against my head. And what? What did Gabriel say? He said the shoot was turning into a nightmare, so I should go ahead and eat without him. He wouldn't get back until 10 at the earliest. I hung up. My husband is on his way home, I said. He'll be here in a few minutes. You should go now before he gets back. The man just laughed. But I heard him say he won't be back until 10, he said. We got hours to kill. Get me some rope, he said, or tape, or something. I want to tie you up. I did as he asked. I knew it was hopeless now. I knew how it was going to end. Alicia stopped talking and looked at me. I could see the raw emotion in her eyes. I wondered if I was pushing her too hard. Maybe we should take a break. No, I need to finish. I need to do this. She went on, speaking faster now. I didn't have any rope, so he took the wire I had for hanging canvases. He made me go in the living room. He pulled out one of the upright chairs from the dining table. He told me to sit down. He started wrapping the wire around my ankles, tying me to the chair. I could feel it cutting into me. Please, I said, please. But he didn't listen. He tied my wrists behind my back. I was sure then he was going to kill me. I wish he had. She spat this out. I was startled by her vehemence. Why do you wish that? Because what he did was worse. For a second, I thought Alicia was going to cry. I felt a sudden desire to hold her, take her in my arms, kiss her, reassure her, promise her she was safe. I restrained myself. I stubbed out my cigarette on the red brick wall. I feel that you need to be taken care of. I find myself wanting to take care of you, Alicia. No, she shook her head firmly. That's not what I want from you. What do you want? Alicia didn't answer. She turned and walked back inside.